Okay, getting started here.
I can hear the crowd.
Yeah, there's like a lot of crowd noise here. All right. All right, folks, as we are gathering, it's good to see everybody coming into our room here to learn about first-time executive directors. So I'm going to just actually kick it off and introduce the subject here by saying that the folks that are involved in this panel today, I'm really happy to see them here because they are participants in a group that we call EDCoP, which is the Executive Director Community of Practice. We've been in place now for, I think, almost 2 years. And it's designed to be sort of an ongoing support and knowledge base kind of a group, informal, for first-time executive directors of small museums. And this is, you know, it's the group itself. We meet once a month, and sometimes we have experts come in to help us out with, you know, thorny problems and other meetings. It's just, you know, talking between ourselves, keeping each other informed about best practices and some of the things that we're going through. But it's really a terrific group, and I'm really happy to have gotten to know everybody and call them friends. So anyway, if you're interested, if you are in fact a first-time ED at a small museum, let me know, and we'll see if you're interested in joining the group. But other than that, we're ready to go. I'm going to hand it over to my friend and colleague Kaleigh Paré to kick off the group. Thanks everybody for being with us. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan. Hi everybody. I'm just going to start our screen share. And so, as Dan said, we are a few of the members of the Executive Directors Community of Practice, also known as EDCoP, organized by NEMA. My name is Kaleigh Paré, and I'm the director of the Patton Homestead, a town-owned historic property in Hamilton, Massachusetts, that was once owned by General George S. Patton Jr. of World War I and World War II fame, and his son, General George S. Patton IV, who fought in Korea and Vietnam. I am also the executive director of the Whittier Birthplace, a house museum honoring the legacy of the abolitionist poet John Greenleaf Whittier in Haverhill, Massachusetts. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from Pentucket, Haverhill, the traditional lands of the Pennacook Abenaki people who have and continue to steward this land along the Merrimack River. I'll now let my colleagues introduce themselves.
I'm Sarah Johnson. I'm the director of the Cahoon Museum of American Art on Cape Cod in a town called Cotuit.
My name is Cynthia Walker. I'm the director of the Brickstar Museum here in Kennebunk, Maine.
And I am Eric Peterson, director of the Metropolitan Waterworks Museum in Chestnut Hill, Mass.
And I'm Cassandra Peltier, and I served as the executive director of the Susan B. Anthony Birthplace Museum in Adams, Massachusetts from September 2018 until earlier this month. And I'm calling in from Williamstown, which are the traditional lands of the Stockbridge Munsee Mohicans.
Thanks, everybody. So EDCoP meets virtually once a month, as Dan suggested. We were Zooming before it was cool. We discuss our challenges, our little wins, and we learn from guest speakers in the field who are experts in topics such as HR, finance, strategic planning, and more. And today we'd like to share with you what we've learned in our first few years as EDs, as well as what we've learned from each other in the EDCoP. You may also be a first-time director, or you might be hoping to move up into the role. If so, we hope our challenges and successes can help you as we've been helped by each other. So we're going to move into our topics. So today we're going to talk about 10 different topics, and we will go back and forth between each of us, and then we will answer some of the questions at the end that come through the chat or the Q&A. So our first topic is learning on the job.
Okay, so again, I'm Cynthia Walker. I'm here at the Brickstore Museum. I got the first topic, learning on the job, and I wanted to start with a story about becoming director here at the Brickstore Museum, and it was about receiving the best piece of advice that I still have from a former director here, and that I wanted to share with everybody. So when I was asked to move up in the world, I started here at the Brickstore Museum as an intern and worked in various different roles here until I was asked to step into the executive director role in 2014. I started by calling the former director, Tracy Bates. She was director when I became an intern, and I asked her some advice about whether I should become director or if I should leave and look for a different job. And she said the best piece of advice that I've ever heard, and she said, you just have to pick one thing to be good at. As executive director of a small museum, you're never going to be able to be good at everything, and you just have to accept that with the job. So in order to start the juggling of all the balls in the air, or if you want to do the plate spinning, either metaphor works, you have to pick one thing to be good at. And as Eric is going to touch on in a couple minutes, I think all of us can agree the first thing that you need to be good at is finances, or at least partially good at it, to be able to understand what's going on. And then Tracy said, once you've gotten good at one thing, move on to the next thing and get good at that. And just make sure that the board understands that some things are going to fall by the wayside until you can get a handle on each item. And then soon enough, you'll be spinning at least 2 or 3 plates in the air, and you can collect something else to be good at. So no matter how much you can prepare after I just said that story, there are things that you're not going to know once you get into the job. This might be a little bit different in terms of how you got to that job. So whether you worked at that museum before or whether you came to that museum as a new employee as the director, both come with their own problems, but also their own advantages. So either way you come into it, you still have that basic knowledge of museum operation wherever you came from in the museum world. And I always try to say, get the fullest picture you can. So if you already work at the museum that you're planning on becoming director of, or if you're lucky enough to know that you have kind of a plan to become director, ask to go to the board meetings. I myself had gone to the board meetings of my museum for about 1.5 years before I became director. And that was a purposeful plan by the previous director here to help kind of segue into a new administration, so to speak. But if you're coming to a new museum, I always advise people to look, this sounds boring, but look at the 990s and then compare that to the staff on the website. That's the best way to get a grasp on. You can see all of the events and all of the fundraising that's done. And then you can compare that to the amount of work that is likely coming your way. If you see that people do 30 events a year, but there's 4 staff, you can probably bet that that's going to be on your plate, and that's fine. It's just better to get a picture of the organization before you actually get there and plan for the worst case scenario. And then if it's better than that, then that's fantastic. Last but not least is training for working in a smaller museum. And the biggest question is, how do I find time to learn when I have all of these other things to do? The best advice that I got, and again, it was from that former museum director, was it's easy to get overwhelmed with good ideas, like all the ones we're hearing here at the NEMA conference. And it's good to keep up with what's happening in the field, but wanting to do all those changes all at once when you're a new director will both overwhelm you and overwhelm the people working with you and in your orbit. So put those ideas in a binder and think of it as your mini strategic plan, whether it's the museum's or not, and then start checking them off as you can and as you grow into your role. Where to look for help? I'll just mention that we have a resource list that we started. I think that's on the handouts that you can find. And then, of course, joining a group like this one.
Kaleigh, could I just interrupt for a moment? We have a request in the chat to expand the slides so that they're easier to see. If you could put it in presentation mode, I think that would help folks.
I'm having a little difficulty with my computer and I can't find the bar for the presentation mode, but let me work on it.
Okay, well, I'm just going to plunge on ahead. Eric Peterson here, Waterworks Museum. So finances. Depending on the size, the age, and the competency of your institution, you really, understanding its financial structure and its procedures can often be overwhelming. And it really might be too much to learn immediately, and ideally, it should be a team process. My recommendation is, as soon as possible, the new director should seek a briefing from the board treasurer for an overall view, and if possible, from a financial professional outside the organization, so to get a better perspective. You certainly can do your own homework and find a basic understanding of the museum's recent financial status and an awareness of its past history by looking at the annual 990 tax forms. It's possible and maybe likely that your predecessor was dismissed because of financial ineptitude. And it's also likely that they left problems unresolved in this area if they have been thinking about leaving for some time. You need to find out where the issues are, and if they look really bad or you don't understand them, you need to think about hiring somebody to help put Humpty Dumpty back together again with his wallet. My case was a little different. I did come up through the ranks, but the position came to me rather unexpectedly. I had no involvement with the financial process, or as Cynthia was mentioning, I had not really been into board meetings, so I wasn't sure of my place. The previous director, I think, from a combination of hubris and ignorance, had created some problems. There were also a revolving door of bookkeepers that led to inconsistent procedures and the really mistaken belief that an organization's endowment could erase all mistakes. So for us, it took nearly 6 months of financial forensics to discover and resolve the issues that we found that we needed to establish a new management system. But once we did that, things got a lot better. If you're lucky, your organization has a tried and true system of cash management, methods for handling money, for making deposits, etc. And if this is in place, you need to learn it quickly. You need also to develop a system that works for you and fits with your organization. So it really should align with commonly accepted internal control standards and procedures. For example, when you're counting money, you need 2 people to sign off on that, so you don't end up being short. In my case, our museum's accountant worked out a system that involved the scanning of every bill, invoice, deposit slip, and check cut. And that way he can manage everything in the cloud, and it's really worked out extremely well. I keep a paper copy of that, but there's always 2 of us that can have input on what's going on. As you gradually become comfortable with the old or the new financial procedures, you'll start to see there really is a larger picture out there outside of the day-to-day operations. So you'll want to be able to create your own spreadsheets and decipher profit and loss statements as you understand or begin to understand your museum's budget. And while all of this is really basic math, it really helps to have a tutor or an assistant for this. However, all things take time, and it's my advice that the very first thing you need to know is how you and your staff get paid. You may have less than 2 weeks to figure this out, and failure in this area has enormous repercussions. I can still very readily recall those times when I was told by my boss, hold off on cashing that check. Not good. To avoid this from happening, your institution should have a payroll service, And you're going to need that, make sure your role is officially recognized by that payroll service. Likewise, the bank needs to officially acknowledge you as the person that's able to sign checks. This will probably require the input of your board chair or treasurer or both. And you'll also need to know what funds are in your payroll account and how to replenish this account if necessary. And you need to make sure you understand that you know the necessary steps to make changes to payroll, such as giving raises or hiring new people. Payroll mistakes sometimes happen, but no one listens to your lame excuses why you don't have their check, okay? And especially when you first start out. So know that the tone of trust and mutual respect that you are hoping to establish with your staff can really be undermined if you don't follow through with timely and consistent payroll delivery. Thank you.
Okay, great. So again, I'm Sarah Johnson from the Cahoon Museum of American Art in Cotuit. So change of identity, transitioning from being one of the guys as staff to being the boss is a major identity shift. Whether you're moving up within your own organization or going to a new organization, your relationship to your peers will change. And I would actually even say sometimes your relationship to yourself changes. So you go from managing your own work in a very specific role to setting the agenda for the whole organization. So this is a really big learning curve. Even if you are a one-person shop, you have more roles to play than you did before. And I found I essentially needed to learn all those other roles in order to manage them. So I'm reminded of the Indian folktale about 6 blind men and the elephant, that each of the men touches a different part of the elephant and describes it a different way. So one's touching the side and describing it as a wall, one's touching the tail and saying it's thin and pointy. And different departments are like this too, that your development person experiences the organization differently than your educator or your visitor services staff. And as the leader, you actually are the only person who sees the entire elephant, and you have to balance all the different perspectives. So in my case, I came from a role, from a career as a curator, and then I had to learn all of these new areas of expertise like budgeting and finance, HR and staff management, and managing up to a board as well. And also part of learning all these new things is actually unlearning many of the things that you knew previously, because you see them in a new way. And that really requires a psychological adjustment. So just be prepared for that. And there is this saying that it's lonely at the top, and it is true. You are no longer one of the guys as one of the staff, and you're also not part of the board either. You're alone in between those two groups. And in this role, many times you have to make decisions that no one understands or no one likes, because no one else has this 360 view of the organization like you do. And I'm reminded of a time when my daughter was a baby and I had to take her to get her first shots. And there was this moment when the doctor's jabbing her arm with a needle, and she made direct eye contact with me with this look like, how can you let this person hurt me? And sometimes it's like that. As a director, you're making decisions and no one understands the context. And so you just end up looking like the bad guy. So for example, I had a longtime staff member who I had to let go. And she was well liked by other staff and volunteers and even the board. And I really couldn't tell the backstory of, she wasn't performing her job. And in fact, I was doing her job and realized I couldn't do both my job and hers. But that personnel information is confidential, so I wasn't able to really explain to anybody. And there were very few people who understood it, but as a result, I ended up looking like the bad guy. So you find yourself really, instead of in your, previously you're in one specific role, to being the center of a network of relationships. And these are your peers, your staff, volunteers, board members, people inside your organization, people outside your organization. And every one of those people is going to give you constant feedback in the form of opinions, also sometimes complaints. A lot of times they're conflicting ideas. So it really ends up feeling like constant pressure. And that's something you do get a little bit acclimatized to, but it's always there. So, you might think when you step into the position, great, now I'm in a position where I can change things, but you're kind of at the eye of this hurricane, and it can be very difficult to steer sometimes, to balance all those different voices. So really, I would say that the only way you learn how to become an executive director is by doing it, and just realizing that you're not alone, that there are other people who have gone through this experience or are going through it, and really staying connected to your peers, and realize you're not alone, which is one reason why the EDCoP group has been really life-saving for all of us, I think.
Okay, so I am back, Cynthia Walker again, to talk about working with boards. This is going to be, we have tried to time this so we can get through each of the 10 lists. This is probably the most bulky. So I will probably not mention everything to know about working with boards, but these are just a few things that we as a group have talked about what we've learned along the way working with each of our boards. First, the most important thing in my mind to remember is that the board is made up of human beings. They're all individuals. So treat them like individuals, and they will hopefully do the same in return for you. How a board should work, the way we all hope it does when we get an executive director position, is, everyone's going to raise money, everyone's going to volunteer for everything you ask for. Someone will take charge of the gala and pick out the napkin colors so you don't have to, and they all will appreciate your work and say a word of thanks or two every once in a while. It's probably not going to be that way. And at worst, hopefully this is somewhere in the middle, but at worst, board members may actively work against success of the institution or yours. It can get incredibly personal, and the board oversteps. The board doesn't take the lead on strategic decisions, and they either knowingly or unknowingly risk the institution and its financial standing. So hopefully that is not the case for you. I like to think about the basic confusion of any nonprofit board, where most folks on the board are volunteering their time outside of their professional life and seem to leave all the professional and HR training they ever had at the door. Even though in their professional lives, they would probably know a bit better. And those folks come up against the people, all of us, who work at museums in a professional way. And then that makes there two very different standards at play, and you really have to keep this in mind so you won't be surprised or disappointed. One of the big things is figuring out who's the boss, and that answer can differ in different situations. You really have to remind board members. We at my museum, we had a really frank discussion at one of our board meetings about if you are volunteering in the collections data entry area 1 day a week, that makes you a volunteer, even if you're a board member. So you're working under staff. And then when you come to a board meeting, you're of course putting on a different hat and you are a board member. Most descriptions, and you really want to pay attention to this if you're looking at a director position, most descriptions will say the board hires the executive director to manage operations. And make sure what you see to see what responsibilities you'll have as director, what you need to do and what you have the authority to do. And then also compare that to what the board's responsibilities are. And then also note that most descriptions will say the executive director hires the staff and you are in charge of the staff, not the board. Again, it's really important to emphasize volunteer hats versus board hats. That's where a lot of confusion comes from. And if you have a board like mine, for which I'm incredibly thankful, but many members will look to you to guide the conversation and for a lot of the decision making. And I've heard in the past, I'll actually go with whatever you tell us to do, which is a wonderful vote of confidence in one way, but it can also make decision making a very lonely and risky process. So you got to try to pull in people where you can for some feedback. A warning on the who's the boss power struggles, and this is referencing what I said at the very beginning about remembering that people are human beings and they're individuals. Power disputes appear in a variety of ways, and you have to learn to recognize that. So it could come out in sidebar comments or outright anger at a board meeting, or somehow seeming to sabotage a program or a project, anything like that. So you really have to remain professional and courteous, and then nobody will be able to call you out on anything other than being a professional director. One thing I want to mention is make sure that you get an annual review. I think boards like to put that off because nobody likes to face confrontation. But without an annual review, you and the board could be diverging in paths. I've seen quite a few here in Southern Maine, small museums where a director did not get a review for 5 years. And then the board, after 5 years, was at odds with that director because both parties thought that they were in the right. And then it ended up that the director got fired. So you don't want to land in that role. So always request an annual review so then you can both keep on the same track. Last piece of information, I think I'll say, or two pieces. Make sure that you are always interacting both with the board members and the staff. You are literally the kind of line between. There we go. Okay. Sorry. And then when you're ready to start having clear and intentional conversations at the board level about specific standards and professional standards that you want. The last thing you need is for lines to be crossed between staff and what's appropriate or not. And you really have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable and approaching those difficult topics. The last piece of advice about boards is make sure your relationship with your board president is a good one, because that is the person who is going to back you up, hopefully has confidence in you and can be a sounding board, whether it's a personal issue or personnel or other private issues that you can't discuss at the board level or anything like that. Check-ins with that person weekly or bi-weekly. It seems like a lot, but it'll help you in the long run. So that is all I have, I think, and I will send it over to our next list.
Okay, Eric Peterson back again live from Chestnut Hill. Staff, yes, staff. Well, a new position is an opportunity for a personal makeover, physically and emotionally, and obviously something you should take very seriously. When you assume a leadership position, even if you've worked your way through up the ranks, it's important to convey a sense of stability, consistency, and competency. And it's likely that your predecessor, or maybe even the organization entirely, was lacking in one or all of these areas. So your new staff is going to be watching closely for visual cues from you. This may be superficial scrutiny, but it's something to be prepared for. They're looking for signs of confidence in you and a willingness to accept responsibility, because change brings uncertainty, and everybody, even if they've been complaining for years, wants to feel like things are going to be stable and return back to normal. So take this opportunity to be your own best self. Whenever possible, your organizational decisions need to be unemotional and calmly considered. That's really important. Your new attitude could be perceived by some as reserved or remote by your former colleagues. I did have a colleague tell me, a friend that I had come up through the ranks with, that ever since you've become the boss, you aren't fun to hang out with anymore. So yes, you need to establish a separation or a distance from no longer being one of the gang, because you aren't. And unfortunately, this is a consequence of leadership, but it's absolutely essential that you create that division because you want to establish some sense of impartiality in your decision making. You don't want to try to act differently, just consider your actions more carefully and try to be your honest, natural self, since phoniness is easy to see and often alienating. So it's important to meet with the staff as a group as soon as possible after receiving your position. But before you do that, prepare yourself. So it's okay to briefly acknowledge what came before and outline the challenges ahead. But you need to emphasize that this is a new beginning. And as tempting as it is, sometimes it can be very tempting. You do not want to dwell on past organizational blunders or personal issues. I had a special instance in my museum where I was instructed by the museum's transition team that any discussions about the departure of the previous director would have legal ramifications for the institution. So I couldn't even talk about that. But maybe that made it easier. By presenting the staff with an outline of what you expect in the immediate future, you can underscore that you are prepared and then you have an awareness of the issues that need attention. You need to emphasize that a leadership change is an opportunity to make positive, maybe slow, but positive changes. And you need to try to explain you're committed to looking out for the best interests of the organization, but make no early promises. I can't emphasize this more. No promises. Get used to saying no. You know, this is something that's hard to do, but you really need to not get yourself in a bind, especially right off the bat, because it takes so much energy to get yourself out of those problems. You need get used to saying things like, let me see what I can do about that, or I'll look into this some more and get back to you. These are the things, the little delay tactics. And invite personal staff input at a later point during individual meetings. Don't allow this initial group discussion to be a place to air grievances. Absolutely not. And again, before you meet with your staff individually, which you should do within a week or so, maybe 2 weeks of accepting the job, prepare yourself in advance. Be familiar with their job descriptions and their performance reviews, if those are available, and try to learn staff expectations, particularly what they expect from you. And be very careful of implementing changes immediately. You really want to try to slow everything down. So there may be people that are unhappy that you're in charge, and you need to see if there are these kind of negative attitudes. For those of you who've risen up through the ranks, your former friends need time to accept this new dynamic, and they may never accept it at all. So you need to stress that you've been an underling and you have a unique insight into how things work. Maybe the previous administrator was too rigid, so you need to find ways to be flexible, such as accommodating different work hours or providing additional hours instead of salary increases. Anything you can do to make things work properly, but flex the options that you have. What else? Let's see. Sometimes employee discontent is a result of unequal or non-transparent policies and really has nothing to do with you. And the change in leadership really is an opportunity for people to express their dissatisfaction with the way the system works in your museum. And you'll know pretty quickly if certain staff refuse to accept your authority. They may not think you're qualified, or they may feel they're passed over, or worse of yet they may continue to express loyalty to the former director. Depending on how they express this satisfaction, you may not have time, or it may never be possible to earn their respect. So you need to grapple with that idea. You need to understand your options regarding employee discipline or termination. You need to review your museum's HR policies, and if you don't have museum HR policies, which was the case in my museum, you need to consider your options very quickly, whether you pay for assistance from a company like HR Demand or find somebody that can provide you advice. You need to start thinking about that quickly. You need to be aware of industry standards and practices and really seek advice before you act, particularly regarding employee discipline. NEMA 911 is really a great place to look. Absolutely don't let things fester or impact other staff members. Don't forget the staff and maybe the board, probably the board too. Well, they're going to be watching for the way you resolve this very first crisis or this challenge to your authority. So you need to be calm and discreet at all times. Don't try to create an HR policy right on the spot, because it takes time and it has to be ratified by the board. So you may have no alternative but to move forward with a termination, but present your plan to the board. And as a last resort, consider a buyout. Thank you.
All right. So now you get to listen to me for two different topics. So a lot of this is probably just common sense to folks who are further along in their careers, but hopefully this will be sort of a good reminder. I got my ED position directly out of undergrad, so it was a very big transition for me. So these are sort of the basic things that I learned, or wish I had learned or known going into it. So this has sort of been touched on briefly, but I think the most basic thing you need to do is manage expectations. That includes your own, as we'll get into a little bit later, knowing that you aren't going to be able to accomplish everything right away. And also just on a day-to-day basis, manage your board's expectations of when they can contact you, how they can contact you. You know, are you sticking to your 9 to 5? Can they email you in the evening? Who has your cell number? When can they contact? Can they give it out to other people? I've had board members give my cell number to their friends so that they can schedule tours on my days off. So for me, that was sort of, you know, that was crossing a boundary. So that was something that needed to be addressed. One thing that can help is revisiting job descriptions, not just your own, but also other staff members, the board members, volunteers, interns, so that everyone knows who's responsible for what aspects of museum operations and daily tasks. And your boundaries may change over time. So for me, I was willing to work 12-hour days when I first came to this job, but that's not sustainable, and I learned that. And then there's also the issue of all of the plates are spinning all the time. There are always fires to put out, hopefully figuratively, not literally. So it's important to have some kind of routine or structure within your day or your week or your month, even on an annual basis. So setting some kind of institutional calendar to guide your year, so you know when you're working on preparations for big events, when you know you're working on intern recruitment, when you know you're going to work on writing grants, etc. And so that the board is also aware of that. They know what demands there are on your time at any given point throughout the year, and they know when they can or cannot add to your list. Sometimes you'll need to do some radical prioritization. So following something like the Eisenhower matrix, where you organize things into buckets based on how time sensitive they are versus how important they are in terms of the overall needs of the institution. Something that can help you and your board in terms of communicating how many demands you have can be tracking your hours and tasks, so that you have an idea of, on a typical week, how many hours you spend on emails versus fundraising versus working one-on-one training staff. And sometimes that can be a good tool to go back to your board and explain to them how much time it takes to manage the social media or whatever else you're working on. You should expect to sort of be derailed from your typical plan for the day. There will be a furnace that goes out or something on the grounds that needs fixing. But having an idea of how much time you need to allocate to the ongoing tasks can really help you figure out if you need to ask a board member to help or bring in more volunteers to help with a certain project. And also, you know, for me, I was walking into a museum that didn't have a lot of written protocol and administrative practices. So documenting that, how do you thank donors for their donations? How do you process membership renewals? Everything like that. If nothing else, it will help the person who comes after you. But at the end of the day, it's very helpful to you, your board, and the staff members you have on the ground. So the next slide, yes. So making sure, you know, we've talked about the financial budget, but there's also the issue of budgeting personnel. Be realistic about whether it's just you working on a project or if you have a team of volunteers, if you have a team of board members, perhaps there's a subcommittee for events. But be realistic about how many people are actually going to work on a project and how much time it's going to take, and always leave extra time. If you can possibly sort of front load work on big projects like galas or annual fundraisers in the quiet season so that you aren't scrambling to get that all put together, that is extremely helpful. And that's one of those times when the annual planning calendar sort of comes into play. And on a daily basis, make sure that you aren't scheduling back-to-back meetings. Make sure you give yourself time to breathe and eat lunch and drink water and check in with your volunteers and talk with your board president right after a meeting while everything is still fresh in your mind. And always refer to the museum's mission and strategic plan to make sure that everything you're doing and everything the people around you are doing are actually supporting the needs of the organization. Some things that I found especially helpful during COVID, because there wasn't really a way to avoid burnout this summer, being pretty much a staff of one, was working from home when possible. If you can't take a vacation, at least being at home in sort of a restful environment can really help re-energize you so that you can go back in with a fresh perspective. And then of course, communicating both to your board when you're at your limit, letting them know if you give me something else to do, something that was already on the list needs to be knocked off. That can be really helpful, just being upfront with them so that they know when things are going to get done and if they can get done. And then related to this is also the topic of balancing work and self-care. For me, again, you know, I was coming out of undergrad, so one of the first things I had to do was sort of unlearn the academic calendar where you are constantly going for a few months and then you have a break. Museums have slow seasons, but those slow seasons are usually filled up with things like grants and recruiting interns and volunteers. So, you know, space your workout, pace yourself. For me, again, this may not be applicable for folks who are further along in their careers. It was a learning curve to separate the job I was performing from self-worth. If people were critical, if people were, you know, within the organization, if we were sort of butting heads, or if people outside of the organization were questioning some of what we were doing, you know, that isn't a reflection on you, that's a reflection on the organization as a whole. And sort of just the position you're in, as Sarah was saying. Sometimes you'll make unpopular choices and you just sort of have to live with that. And also giving yourself permission to sort of unplug, turn off the phone, don't check your work email. As Kaleigh pointed out, you know, don't have your work email on your phone giving you notifications all the time. And don't underestimate simple things you can do, like having your favorite herbal tea or some aromatherapy on your desk, having a little pocket on the museum grounds that you can go to, just to sort of take a break throughout the day. And even if you have a lot at work that you can't sort of step away from, sometimes it's possible to ask friends and family to sort of alleviate some of the stressors outside of work so that there's less pressure on you overall. And then, of course, the big thing is finding mentors and colleagues that can give you support, advice, at least some commiseration. So the EDCoP group has been wonderful for that as well.
So our next section is the timeline of the job. And your first priority is going to be to figure out what your priorities are. This should come both from your board as well as from yourself. Your board may have a different idea about what your priorities should be for the first few months or the first year. You should also have a list for yourself of what you would like to accomplish. And I'd like to circle back to Eric's point that getting a full understanding of the finances should definitely be one of the priorities for your first few weeks and months on the job. You will not know the full cycle until you've been on the job for at least a year. It could be longer. Every institution is different, and the cycles of activities are going to be different museum to museum. For example, some museums have busy field trip seasons in the fall, some have them in the spring, some have large tourist groups that come through the summertime, others get busy in the winter when outside activities are closed. So understand what a year of activity looks like at your museum, and also what the yearly building maintenance and other seasonal issues are going to be, whether it's when the boiler needs to be maintained, or what has to happen if you have outbuildings that need the water turned off before it freezes. You have to have a year to figure out what are all these seasonal issues and when do they take place. So it's going to take at least a year for you to see patterns and to know where changes need to be made. Changes could be staff strength, weaknesses, or other needs with policies and procedures and where maybe changes need to take place. It could take 3 years to fully see the patterns and understand the organization, and then also to be in a position where you can make those changes. Nonprofits are designed to work slowly and deliberately. You will always be making decisions as a group with your board. There is no one leader that can make decisions, whether that is the president or the treasurer, as much as some individuals may like to think that they can. Some organizations have requirements that you have multiple bids on projects over a certain dollar amount. This is going to add up to the group decision making, that you've got different requirements for projects. It's going to take slow. It's going to be slow. It's going to take time, and you're going to be deliberate. Don't be hard on yourself when changes take longer than you expect them to take. Be prepared to articulate the pace of change to your board, to your staff, your volunteers, your community partners, your donors, whoever. What may seem excruciatingly slow for someone from the for-profit business world is normal for nonprofit museums. And one of my favorite examples comes from one of my mentors, and she says that museum time bears no resemblance to actual real time. And you need to know that everything in the museum is going to take longer than what it might take outside a museum. And finally, it can seem like everything is on fire at the same time, and you need to be an expert at triage. And you need to be an expert at communicating why you made the decisions that you made. Someone will always question that decision. And like Cassie, I'm also jumping into 2 in a row. So gender and age, that could be an entire conference in itself. And the process of narrowing down the disappoints for this session have inevitably left out other important topics. Fortunately, there are other NEMA sessions going on in this conference that address some of the inequities that are plaguing the museum fields that I am unable to address right now. My points today come from my personal experience as a young working with mostly older males, many with military backgrounds, as it relates to my job at the Patton Homestead. Learning to assert myself as the boss with people who try to go over or under my head has been a challenge, and I hope to share with you some of the strategies that I've been able to use to be both more assertive and confident in my role as the director. For a little bit of background, the Patton Homestead is a town-owned property. So as the director, I report to the town manager. I'm a department head similar to the head of the Council on Aging or the fire chief. I'm not actually the executive director. So many of the community partners that we've worked with have often tried to go to the town manager, who is my boss, for questions that really should have come to me. And then if my boss needed to be involved, then I should be the one doing it. And getting that message across has taken a lot of repetition to say, no, talk to me. You need to talk to me on this. Don't go to him. Come talk to me. We'll figure this out. You will have doubters. The doubters could come from inside of your organization, your board, your staff, your volunteers. They could come from outside it, those community partners, the donors, the media reps, and sometimes even your visitors. So some of the strategies I've used to be both more assertive and more confident include the following. Overcoming insecurities. Remind yourself that you were chosen for this position because you are the right person for the job. Don't apologize for your position, for your age, for your lack of experience, whatever it may be that's plaguing you. Engage and be confident, and don't let fear get in the way or build a gap in confidence for how you do your job. Surround yourself with people who believe in you and who bring out the best in you. Find a mentor, find a group of peers like the EDCoP. It can be very lonely at the top, especially in small organizations. For context, I am the only staff person at the Whittier Birthplace, and at the Patton Homestead, I am part of the larger organization within the town, but I'm a department of one, and I'm physically located on the opposite end of town from the other departments. Practice resilience. Resilience is the quality that allows you to overcome stress and adversity and to come back strong, maybe even stronger than before. Psychologists have identified there are a few factors to help you build resilience. Maintaining a positive attitude and optimism, the ability to see failure as not as a setback, but as a way to get stronger next time, and regulating your emotions. In particular, I find that breathing exercises can help with regulating emotions. I'm a fan of box breathing. If you don't know, you will breathe in for 4 seconds, hold it for 4 seconds, breathe out for 4 seconds, hold it for 4, and then you repeat around until you've got control of your heart rate, your breathing, and you can address a situation that maybe would have put you over the top otherwise. Another key part is learning to take risks. There was an article in The Atlantic recently called The Confidence Gap, that there was a report that outlines that women often lack the confidence to take the risks that men do not. So ladies, take a risk, take a leap, give it a try, speak up, be kind, but convicted in your effort to take a seat at the table. The guys are doing it, so we should too. And finally, I want to mention a little bit on salary negotiations. You have the tools available to know what you should be paid. So consult the NEMA or the AAM salary survey. They have reports to give you what other people in the position are making based on an organization's size, location, that sort of thing. So know your worth and ask for it. The worst thing that can happen is that they'll say no. If you don't ask, the money that they might have paid to somebody who did ask won't come to you.
So to conclude our presentation, long-term career plans. Sometimes you need to step back from time to time and really think about your whole career journey. What was your original passion? Are you still fulfilled? Is it worth it? When they train race car drivers, they tell them focus on the road, not on the wall. When you're going around a curve at 200 miles an hour, you can't look at the wall ahead of you or you'll crash into it. You have to keep your eyes on the road. And if you follow the road, if you focus on the road, you'll follow the road. So being an executive director is a lot like that. There are 1,000 things on fire. And if you focus too much on them, you're just going to drive yourself nuts. You have to focus on where you're going rather than on what you hope to avoid. And this is really, really hard to do when you're immersed in the 24/7 nature of the job. But you periodically have to step back from time to time and think about the big picture and what you want to accomplish. For example, when I went into the museum that I work at, I had a goal of getting the museum accredited. I also want to build an endowment. And then I periodically have to assess the feasibility of that. As Kaleigh was saying, you know, it can take a few years just to learn your annual cycle. So keep in mind that you will become resilient and you will master the learning curve. But at the same time, there are going to be those days where you just feel like quitting and walking away. And I would say that there's no shame in stepping out of the role if it doesn't fit your life plans. So we expect our careers to be linear, but life isn't linear. So we may have young children, we may have aging parents, we may have to move, or we may have an illness. But keep in mind that many of the skills that you learn as a director are transferable. And I wanted to read you a quote from Vu Lee, who some of you may know from Nonprofit AF, which is a really, really funny and valuable resource. He says, you constantly learn new skills and hone existing ones. Among them are public speaking, writing, facilitation, giving and receiving feedback, evaluation, negotiation, basic bookkeeping and accounting, HR, supervision, strategic thinking, event planning, method acting, speed reading, plumbing, carpentry, and beginner scripture. Seriously, I feel like my years of being an ED have prepared me to handle anything. And it's funny to me because I actually am working on a scrimshaw exhibition. So you will learn a lot of random skills. But there are many supports to help you on your journey. Among them, you can do an executive leadership program. You can get a personal coach. You can solicit feedback from your peers and your superiors. And you can also join a peer group like NEMA, which has really been life-saving and helpful. And with that, I think we would really like to hear your questions and answer some of those for you.
So we had a couple of questions. One question was just generally if the slides will be available, and we can try to make those available. Whoops, we can try to make those available in the resources section for folks to sort of go back.
Yes, and I'd like to apologize for my computer not responding to what I'm telling it to do. So we will definitely get the slides submitted to the handout section that you can find on the NEMA website. I'll submit it today, and I know it sometimes takes a little while to get uploaded, but it should be there, so you'll have all of our slides.
A little earlier in the chat, there was the question, do you think you would have chosen your ED path differently if you knew we would be faced with a pandemic? What is your advice to those who are contemplating the ED role, especially during this COVID era? There was sort of a, I'm not sure if this was directly responding to it, but someone in the chat said that they'd been in the position of ED for 2 years, and if you're a person who can ride the wave or roll the punches, you should consider the position. But I figured I would open it up to the other panelists to address that, and I'll look for other questions.
I guess so I saw that question before and I was thinking about it, and I don't think I would have done anything differently. I think it's important to realize that now you just have to know something new, which is about health information. So a lot of people were looking to me to understand what was going on in our state and what was going on in the country, and kind of the following the trends of where we thought we should close or open. So it just took on a whole new area of understanding that you had to grasp.
Yeah, I would say makes no difference. I mean, when I took over this job, we were in a real mess as an institution, and it was all about creating a sense of calm and consistency. And I really felt like when the epidemic hit, it came right back. You know, we're going to figure this out. We're not going to go nutty on what to do. We're going to take advice as best we can, and just remain consistent and calm in what we do. And that's, I don't see there's much alternative to that. So I don't think I would have made any other decisions other than keeping going and trying hard to work around the issue.
I would add too that it actually is an opportunity for a lot of us. I've looked across the museum that I work at, and I think now is a really great time to make changes. If there's any changes you wanted to make, there's so much change going on that now's the time to do it. And also, we're just really in this moment where we're assessing, how relevant our museums are to our communities, and thinking about new ways we can creatively adapt. And I would say in our field, we're so skilled at creative adaptation that it is incredibly stressful, especially the financial part, knowing that you have staff members who rely on your organization for their salaries, and the stress of extra fundraising and sometimes not knowing where that money is going to come from. But at the same time, it really is exciting in some ways to be able to rewrite our museums.
So we have two other questions. One that came in a few minutes back, which is, I'm currently in the interim ED position. Is there any advice for going in the opposite direction back to my position as advancement director once the search committee hires a new ED? And my follow-up question to that was sort of, has this transition been discussed with the board already? Because I think that's the biggest piece, is making sure that you're all on the same page. But I didn't know if any of you had any insight into that.
I have not done the transition in the other direction, but I would point to some of Sarah's points in the last slide, that there is no shame in going in what can seem like the opposite direction. We think of our careers as being a ladder or a staircase or a mountain, but if you are climbing that mountain and you've reached the top and you think there's nowhere left to go but down, sometimes you have to go down a little bit of a knoll to go up to a higher peak. So if what works for you is going back to more of a department head than an executive director, then do that. That shouldn't affect the way you make the decision. It's your life, it's your career, and you need to balance both work priorities and outside of work priorities. Cassie, I don't know if you also have any insight, since you have recently stepped down from your ED position.
I mean, I would say if advancement is where you feel at home, and if that's a comfortable role for you that has worked for you in the past, and you were just sort of asked to step into the position of ED temporarily, then if that's what you want to do, just talk with your board and make that happen, if possible. But yeah, basically what Kaleigh said and what Sarah has said would be my input as well. And then we have another question that says, where's the joy in your work? Great advice, but very gloomy. So is it okay if I just sort of start that off? So one thing I would say is a lot of people I talk to who work as an ED, especially similar to me, where you're the only full-time staff member on site, a lot of the joy is just from interacting with visitors. So at the Susan B. Anthony Birthplace Museum, we had a lot of visitors who came who were women who had just gotten their US citizenship, and they were coming to thank Susan B. Anthony because she was a pioneer that allowed women to vote. We also had a lot of kids because it was Susan B. Anthony's birthplace and she lived there until she was 7. So there were a lot of young kids who were either, they were in first grade and they were really interested in history, or they hadn't even started school yet, but they wanted to see the old objects. And so, there were things, especially at a small museum, that you wouldn't see at a big museum. Like I was working with a friend from the Mount Holyoke College Art Museum to install an exhibit that involved children's shoes. And so there was this little girl with her grandmother, and she was very quiet and very well behaved. And so we gave her a pair of gloves, and she was able to hold a pair of antique children's shoes. And she just had this moment where like her face was glowing, and she must have felt like, the royalty being able to hold this antique thing. So it's the moments like that where you can really make an impact or a difference, or see how the museum is impacting someone, or opening someone's perspectives. That I think is where a lot of the joy comes in for me. And I'll let other folks jump in.
Yeah, it's hard to find joy, but there are times it creeps up on you. I'd have to say mine is kind of the moment when you're always the last person out of the place, shutting the lights off and looking around. And it's sort of that you're saying goodnight, John boy, to nobody that's there. And then you come back in the morning and start all over and doing it again. And that sense of stewardship and responsibility is really tremendous. Makes you feel good.
Yeah, I have to say, I just love museums, and I've tried having other kinds of jobs, and I'm just built for museums. So like Eric, having those moments when you're sometimes alone in the museum, or for me, sometimes being alone in collection storage, even oddly enough, the smell of collection storage makes me really happy. There are certainly long days and weeks where you're staring at spreadsheets and preparing for board meetings, and not all of that is fun, but the creative challenge of making the whole thing work actually it will definitely stretch you. And I think in stretching, you find strength. Sometimes you feel tired, but sometimes, you're stretched and it feels good. And I would say also building a team of staff. And when you really get a good team going, and you're really connected to the mission, there's really nothing like that. You're all, especially I would say during the pandemic, we're kind of in the trenches together. And I think we actually, we really just focused on getting our museum through. And like Cassie was saying, the feedback from the community and the joy, and sometimes you forget, and then someone will send you a note and says, by the way, we love this exhibit. My grandchild loved it. One person wrote in and said it was the best day of their year being at our museum. So I was like, yay. So it's those little moments do get you through.
I put in that the joy comes from overcoming the challenges that you faced. And we were a little concerned when we were putting this together that we were going to end up scaring people away from taking ED jobs, but we wanted to be honest. And so some of that honesty comes across as being a little gloomy, as you say. But when you overcome those challenges that you're faced with, you do have that joy, that excitement, whether it's from a program that had more people attend than you were expecting, getting awarded a grant. We did have a system within the EDCoP to share our little wins. And sometimes when you are at the top, or you are the only person at the organization, you want to turn to somebody next to you who you could have in the different position and say, guess what, this happened, but then there's nobody there next to you to tell them that. And it can be a little lonely, but we've used our group together to say to the person next to us at our EDCoP groups, this happened, I'm so excited, I want to share it. We had somebody in our group get featured on Chronicle, which we were all very excited for them. Whenever we've had somebody have an exhibition that opened with, great numbers of people visiting or coming under budget or whatever the exciting part is, we're able to share it with each other. And I think that's been a huge part of why so many of us have stayed in this group for our second year.
I just want to speak up and echo everything that everyone's been saying. And I want to do a special shout out for those of you watching that might be introverted. If you couldn't tell, I'm extremely introverted. I'm sure this is the most, actually this EDCoP group has heard me speak. And I just want to say that introverted people have your own talents. And so if you're not outspoken, you can still lead an organization. And it leads back to what Eric and Sarah and Kaleigh and Cassie were all saying about, at the end of the day, you look around and you realize that you've either helped lead or been leading this organization. And it's really about the stewardship. If you look, you lift your head and take the blinders off of all the list of things that you need to do, and you realize that this institution that you've been leading has really improved the community in some way or touched a person's life in some way and made it better. That's the reward at the end of the day.
Cynthia, someone is asking if you can tell us more about the poster behind you, the courage, cheerfulness, etc. poster.
That's a very, very good question. So as I just referenced, I'm an introverted person, so I like to send messages in a lot of different ways. And this poster is an old World War I poster from Britain. It goes along with the keep calm and carry on, but it's just another message, obviously. So I put this right behind my desk the door to my office is right across from me. And especially in the time of COVID, but this has been hanging in my office for about 2 to 3 years. I just like to send it as a simple reminder to everybody here. As I opened one of my topics with, you just have to remember that everybody's a human being. So reminding everybody, even in a simple way, the sign is probably not the best way, but it's just a simple reminder to treat everybody with kindness, whether you are the director or you're the intern or anywhere in between. Is if we're all working together, it'll help us all. So I keep it there just to remind everybody of that.
We have another question that says, what advice do you have when the ED feels like she is not being supported by the board? I am speaking of not contributing financially, not attending events, not responding to good news, etc.
Cassie, can you read the first part of that again, the question?
What advice do you have when the ED feels like she's not being supported by the board?
Well, it is tough. I think that a lot of times people will say the relationship between the ED and the board or the board president is the most important one, because if those two areas aren't working together, the organization just can't work. And there are those times. I will actually say that I've been at my museum for almost 5 years, and there have been 6 different board presidents. So the high turnover has really been disruptive for me, and for various reasons that occurred. And it's really hard because you just don't feel in sync. And there's so many moving parts of your organization. If there's an obstacle, it kind of affects everything. But there are times when you also just have to keep going. And sometimes board members come and go, and different board presidents have different priorities or leadership styles. So it is, I think some of my most difficult moments have been when I've had either a micromanaging board president that really got into the staffing and other things. And then also I had two co-presidents who were really not involved at all, and I felt very much alone. So, and I guess I don't have the answer to that other than I would, defer back to our EDCoP, because we've actually worked through some of these scenarios together, and then you rely on the experience of your colleagues to help you out.
I'm not seeing any other questions, but there are a lot of great comments in the chat, and there was Dawn recommended reading the first 90 days. So if anyone missed that in the chat, definitely echo that recommendation. But yeah, that's all I see for now for questions.
I wonder if there's other attendees who actually are first-time directors who have also anything they thought we missed or anything we should highlight. I know I wish I had a session like this when I started, because like I said, I was a curator. I really didn't have directorship experience, and I didn't know to read the first 90 days. So I was just it took me a while to figure it all out.
Yeah, some of the advice that's been coming through has been making sure to hire really talented staff. Some folks are saying specifically in the areas where you don't have expertise, and looking at complementary styles, hire what you think you're missing on the team, which can also go, if your board is sort of restructuring itself, that can apply for both higher administration and even volunteers. And then there was also sort of a brief discussion about some institutions allow staff to participate in board meetings while others do not. And some institutions where staff don't participate in the board meetings, there is sort of a social event for board members and staff to interact. So just sort of thinking about the how that creates a different work climate at different organizations. So that was some of what was happening. And then the most recent comment is, I do think your comment about board relationship, it's constantly changing as officers and trustees term on and off. As the ED, you can play a big role in shaping your board and take an active role. So it is very rewarding and very important when you can, as an ED, sort of take that position. You cannot always take that position, but when you can, it could be really rewarding for you and your community. And then someone else says that looking at successful business models in for-profit organizations can work in nonprofits. Don't be afraid to be creative. Scrum and Agile method has worked to unify our staff and build trust and transparency after 4 EDs in 4 years. So yeah, there can be some sort of creative jumping between different business models.
Yeah, I would say too, it's, nonprofits are difficult organizations to run sometimes because you find yourself always under-resourced, and you may build a really awesome team and then you're not able to compensate them as much as you want to, or anything like that. But, it is your role too, to kind of be the remover of obstacles, like to make sure you're, really giving your team a platform where they can do their best, and just periodically checking in with them. Is there anything that's preventing you from doing your job, or any obstacles? And then you're kind of trying, and my museum, when I started, we didn't even have a computer network. We had like really outdated computers. So one of the first, I was like, no one can do a good job if you're using crappy equipment. So I raised some money and we got that all working, and that can be satisfying too. And then on the other side with the board, I know a colleague on Cape Cod, the director of the Provincetown Art Museum, she has something called a board boot camp, where she has like little 20-minute focus areas where she kind of lets the board in on the staff work to see, so that they really have an understanding of the daily work of running the museum. So a lot of times your role is just a facilitator of understanding and removing obstacles to people being able to do their job.
I saw that we have another question that just came in through the Q&A asking who we should contact to get involved with the EDCoP. And there is a link on the NEMA website, and we will add it to the Q&A answers, the A's of the Q's, so that you can learn more about EDCoP and decide if you want to get involved too. So I guess if we have no other questions from the Q&A or the chat, we can end about 10 minutes early. Thank you everybody for attending, and thank you to our participants for sharing your knowledge. We are all on this journey of learning how to do this job together, and sometimes we're giving a helping hand, and so we're so excited that we're able to share with you what we've learned, our challenges and our successes over our first couple of years as directors of small museums.
And I would add, feel free to reach out to us too. It's been one of the wonderful things about the NEMA conference is just being with other museum people and seeing what other museums our size are up to. So definitely reach out to us. We're always, it's a great thing about the museum field is I think everybody's so collegial. I mean, I've randomly cold called other museums like development departments and things like that, and people are always willing to help. So reach out.
Any other last words?
Nope.
Okay. Well, thank you everybody. Happy NEMA.
Yeah. Enjoy
Thank
your
you.
conference.